It's the 10th of April 1855 in the colony of Victoria. A little over 4 months ago, on the goldfield of Ballarat, an armed clash between gold miners and Her Majesty's forces erupted. It was over in 20 minutes or so, and peace was quickly restored, but something as violent and shocking as a pitched battle has a way of grabbing headlines.
Extra, we do about it!
And the latest headlines regarding what is already being called the Battle of the Eureka Stockade have certainly been something to talk about. They've focused on the trials of 13 stockaders, all of whom were charged with high treason in the wake of the fight. Between the 22nd of February and the 27th of March, these trials took place in the Victorian Supreme Court, and Charles Hotham's government was certain that this would be the perfect way to restore order and public confidence in their decisions following Eureka. It wasn't. The government's bungling in the wake of the attack led to a surge of public support for the stockaders. 12 of the 13 were acquitted and charges were withdrawn against the 13th, which was a major embarrassment for the establishment. The problem, as the Colonial Secretary in London later wrote blisteringly to Charles Hotham, in the same letter which told him he was fired, was that high treason was difficult to prove and public sympathy was against the government almost from the beginning. Hotham was an unpopular figure. He had already been seen as something of a tyrant before Eureka, and his decision to try and orchestrate show trials, which failed spectacularly, only diminished him further in the eyes of the public. And from his hiding place in Geelong, someone else has been watching the slow self-destruction of Sir Charles Hotham, while also following the high treason trials with keen interest. He's not merely a public spectator, though. He was the leader of these men. He's the reason these trials are being held. He's wanted for the same offence. And if that wasn't enough, there's a £200 reward for any person or persons giving such information as may lead to his apprehension. This man's name? Peter Fenton Lalor. He was delighted with the outcome of the trials, as was the public. And today, the people of Victoria will get to hear from him directly. On page 7 of the Argus, a popular Victorian newspaper, is an open letter addressed to the Colonists of Victoria. Stretching over a quarter of the page and coming in at 3,221 words, not including an incomplete list of the dead and wounded, it purports to be nothing less than the truth, told by the Commander-in-Chief of Eureka himself, about what really happened on that terrible Sunday morning and the events that led to it. It's a detailed account, full of righteous indignation and ringing with calls for justice. It's a searing indictment on the misgovernment of the Ballarat goldfields and the colony of Victoria as a whole, and ends with the bold claim that he, Peter Lalor, has taken measures to have the history of the outbreak and its causes brought before the House of Commons in London, in order that the real authors of the bloodshed may be brought to trial. Those real authors, the letter constantly reminds the reader, are the government, the police, the military and the Goldfields administration, all of whom, in some way or another, take orders from London. The stockaders were entirely innocent. They were forced to build a defensive barrier, to take up arms, to prepare to fight, and none of them have a case to answer. Lalor goes further and tells his reader that, just in case they were worried that the wrathful Victorian government might somehow prevent him from presenting his truth to the House of Commons, that there are numbers of people ready and willing to come forward and prove the facts that he has put forward in his letter. Or were there? And perhaps more pressingly for history, are there any facts in his letter at all? I'm Juliana, and you're listening to The Skeptical Historian Writes a Thesis. Hello, my fellow skeptics, and welcome back to another episode. Before we head down the winding path of Peter Lalor's letter to the colonists, I want to start by acknowledging that I am podcasting today on the sovereign lands of the Wurundjeri Wathaurong people. I recognise their deep and continuous connection to the lands, waters and skies of their home, and extend that respect and acknowledgement to any Indigenous people listening today. I'd also like to let you know that this episode will be a two-parter due to the length and complexity of the document I want to examine, so make sure you tune in next fortnight to get the rest of the story. A quick reminder that if you need a refresher about the Eureka Stockade, you can check out my 2 episodes on the subject from Season 1, because I'm skipping the background today and we're going to dig right in and consider Peter Lalor and his open letter. Lalor is a colourful and mildly controversial figure in the history of Victoria, and he was certainly one of the Eureka Stockade's most famous, or perhaps infamous, participants. To be honest, I'd probably need another double episode to examine him in any detail, as he was an incredibly complex man, but my purpose today is to examine his famous 1855 letter to the people of Victoria. No serious study of the Eureka Stockade can ignore this source. I've personally found it indispensable myself in writing my thesis, but like any historical document, it needs to be analysed properly and considered in context. I have found works in the course of my research that treat this letter as if it is the Holy Gospel of Eureka, usually justifying this view because it was written by Lalor, who was present at the stockade during the fight and was a central figure in the events which led up to the attack on Sunday morning. As we will see in the next 2 episodes, Lalor was never quite as involved as he claimed to have been, nor was he exactly the champion of the common man he presented himself as. But, first things first, a little background. I'm not going deep into Lalor, I'll save that for a future episode, but it is worth knowing who he was and what his credentials were, so to speak. So Lalor was born in Ireland in 1827 to a very politically active family in Queen's County, which is today County Laois in the Republic of Ireland. His father was a member of the House of Commons, and his older brother Fintan was heavily involved in the Young Ireland movement, which was campaigning for independence from Britain. They used both violent and non-violent methods, and there were fractures within the group about the best way to do this. Peter Lalor himself was not involved in Young Ireland, and instead he attended Trinity College in Dublin and qualified as a civil engineer. He immigrated to Victoria with his brother Richard in 1852, shortly after their older brother Fintan died following the collapse of the Young Ireland movement. And he didn't dig for gold initially, but he ran an alcohol carting business between Melbourne and Geelong. Later, he put his skills and qualifications to good use, and he was part of the engineering team assisting with the construction of the Melbourne to Geelong railway line. But in 1853, he decided he was going to try his luck on the goldfields. He went first to Beechworth and then to Ballarat, and it was in Ballarat that he became involved in the reform movement, eventually becoming the leader of those advocating violence and physical force to get what they wanted. What started as speeches and meetings and rhetoric quickly devolved and culminated in the armed clash at the Eureka Stockade, which, as we know, led to the government reasserting control. Lalor managed to dodge the authorities and was never charged over his involvement. He was later elected to the Victorian Legislative Assembly, and he served in both the Assembly and the Council for a combined total of 30 years before dying in 1889 at the age of 62. So that's Peter Lalor in a nutshell. And if you take just one thing away from that short description, I want it to be this. Lalor was an intelligent man from a political background who was very, very ambitious. On the ship over from Ireland, he told a friend that he intended to get himself elected to the Victorian Parliament within 2 years. Despite all the drama that ensued in between his arrival and his election, he actually kept almost to that time frame. He was a member of Parliament within months of writing his letter. He was elected in November 1855. So keep this in mind as we go through this document. The other thing to remember as we're examining his words is that he's writing them almost 4 months after Eureka had taken place and in the wake of the well-publicised shambles that were the high treason trials. There's still technically a reward being offered for his capture, And he doesn't yet know that the government has quietly decided to follow a course of unofficial amnesty regarding Eureka, although they will shortly make it official. Lalor's also writing shortly after a royal commission into the state of the goldfields, which had been sitting since the 16th of November 1854, has handed down its report detailing the mismanagement of the goldfields and suggesting sweeping changes. Much of the report had already been published by April 1855, and the government had begun implementing a lot of these proposed reforms. In short, Lalor knew public feeling was with him, and that's something that needs to be taken into account. He had months in which to write the truth, as he called it, but chose not to. Instead, he waited until he knew people would agree with him and be less likely to question his account before publishing. Remember, this is someone who wants to be elected to Parliament, and if nothing else, he knows how to play a political game. So, with that in mind, let us begin. Now, because the letter is so long, I'm not going to read it in full at the beginning. Rather, I'm going to summarise as we go through, and I will quote the important parts. And I'll put a reading of those parts I examine in this episode at the end, following the credits. You can also read the letter yourself online via the National Library of Australia's website Trove, and I'll provide a link to it on my social media channels and on my website, which I am pleased to share is back up and running. You can come and visit me again, www.skepticalhistory.com. That's skeptical with a K. Now, to Lalor's letter. It begins with reference to the high treason trials, which had ended about 2 weeks before this letter was published. And Lalor says he felt compelled to write it because his name had appeared so frequently at the trials, which was true, and he wanted to justify himself. He also states that it is his intention to snatch from oblivion the names of the dead who fell at Eureka, although he does take a rather long time to mention them. Much of the letter is devoted to his account of the events before and during the stockade, while occasionally breaking in to appeal to the colonists' better judgment and imploring them to side with him. Most of them already do, and Lalor was aware of this when he published his letter. He starts by discussing how law was administered on the goldfields prior to the 7th of October 1854, which those of you who listened to last fortnight's episode will know was the date Scotty Scobie was murdered. He talks about the licence tax, the unfair land system, and the understandable frustration of the diggers at having to produce their licence multiple times a day whenever a policeman demanded to see it. The police in Ballarat at this time were poorly trained and prone to corruption, and the licence law was often deliberately misapplied. According to the law, a digger had to carry their licence with them and produce it whenever ordered to do so by the authorities. But the licences were made of paper and gold mining was wet, muddy work. So, unsurprisingly then, many miners kept their licences in their tent to stop it getting wet and ruined, but that didn't matter to the police. If a digger didn't have their licence on them then and there, that was as good as not having one, and they were arrested. It cost 30 shillings a month to take out a licence, which was a considerable sum for men who had no guaranteed source of income, and the fine for being caught without one was £5. To help put those figures in perspective for you, in Victoria at the time, the average yearly wage for a labourer, so someone who was employed and earning wages, was £20, which means the fine for being caught without a licence was about a quarter of the average annual wage. And gold miners were not earning wages, or most of them weren't at this point. There were some companies on the goldfields, but the miners that Lalor is discussing were effectively independent small businessmen. Now, as for the sum of 30 shillings, a pound at this time, that is in 1854-55, was worth 20 shillings. So this is effectively £1 10 shillings. And again, remember, gold miners are not earning wages. So they didn't always have the money. They didn't always want to pay it either. And the policy itself was enforced very unfairly by untrained men who were more interested in building revenue because police got 50% of the fines if they caught a digger breaking the law. As you can imagine, this led to all sorts of corruption, but it was the licence that was the chief grievance of the diggers at this time, as Lalor points out. And along with this was the inability of these men to buy land due to the system of selling it in huge parcels, so only the very wealthy could afford it. And by 1854, a lot of men wanted to settle. They wanted to bring their families out if they weren't already with them. They wanted to start looking for work if gold mining hadn't been good for them. A lot of them didn't want to go back to the city. Melbourne was not a particularly pleasant place to live in 1854, and a lot of them preferred it out in the country near the goldfields. So the inability to buy land was a big, big deal. Now, all these opening points by Lalor are absolutely fair. As I've said time and time again on this show, and I'm sure I'll say it again in the future, the goldfields were being shockingly mismanaged. And because voting was restricted to the propertied classes at this time, the diggers were denied the franchise as well, which meant they had few ways of making their voices heard. Petitions were a popular method of speaking up, and one that was submitted to Governor Latrobe, Hotham's predecessor, asking for a removal or reduction of the licence fee in 1853 contained more than 30,000 signatures. Now, I'm going to put that in perspective for you. The population, or I should say the white population of Victoria in 1853 was 198,496 people. There may have been some variance due to changes in the way births and deaths had been registered, but that means that about 15%, slightly over, of the entire population of the colony signed that petition. And it also shows you how many people were on the goldfields. Because this petition, it did go to the cities, but there aren't a lot of city-dwelling signatures on it. Most of them are coming from Bendigo, Beechworth, Castlemaine, Ballarat, all the big goldfields at the time. So it shows you where the population is. It also shows you how deep the feeling against the licence was. Now, the land question, though, was a bit more complicated. It is true that it was being mismanaged by a class of people who benefited from it being kept out of reach of the majority of settlers, but the assumption made, and not just by Lalor, but by quite a few of the Goldfields writers, that owning land was a guarantee to a better, richer life was misplaced. Now, part of this desire for land was cultural, especially among British and Irish immigrants, as owning land was associated with class mobility and brought with it certain privileges. However, then, as now, farming was risky work, and it certainly offered no promise of wealth. Lalor then mentions the events of the 7th of October 1854, that is the murder of James Scotty Scobie, but doesn't go into details and barely mentions the uproar that followed, including the burning down of James Bentley's Eureka Hotel. He does stress that everything that followed Scobie's murder was, of course, the fault of the authorities. Now, I discussed the burning of the Eureka Hotel in detail last episode, so if you need a recap, make sure you check out Burning Down the House. So I'm not going to go into it here, except to say that while Lalor is right in saying that the diggers were angry, and they had good reason to be angry, it wasn't the authorities who chose to burn down the Eureka Hotel. Lalor was there. He was in the crowd the day the hotel burned and undoubtedly participated, although precisely what action he took, whether he tore off weatherboards, threw stones, helped light the fire, or simply stood by and jeered as staff and guests fled for their lives from the burning building, has been lost to history. I'm going to pause here for a quick break, and we'll continue to unpick Lalor's letter in a moment. Sit tight, skeptics. I'll be right back. Welcome back. You are listening to The Skeptical Historian Writes a Thesis, and we are examining Peter Lalor's 1855 letter to the Victorian colonists. Following on from his very weak justifications regarding the burning of the Eureka Hotel, Lalor begins to wax lyrical about the aftermath. The authorities were shocked by just how violent everything had been, and it was easy, with hindsight, for Lalor to say that had the police and the Goldfields administration left things alone, the diggers would have calmed down. Now, I actually agree with this, and it's also the opinion of multiple historians who've been studying this much longer than I have, but the authorities didn't have the benefit of hindsight. And they also didn't know if the men who had burned down the hotel were organised or if there was a possibility they could storm government camp. Now, the diggers had actually been openly talking about doing so, which is something Lalor completely omits in his letter, and he would have known about it because we know he was involved in a lot of those discussions. Now, given that the diggers had just one day earlier burned down a building and attempted to murder the people inside it, the authorities had every reason to believe that they could and would commit further violence. Unfortunately, rather than try to de-escalate the situation, the government opted to put on a show of strength. Stupidly, they arrested 3 men at random and charged them with arson, including one man who had actually attempted to put the fire out. With the information the authorities had, they should have known this would have caused further outrage on the diggings, and Lalor was absolutely right to viciously chide them for it in his letter. It was idiotic. It was just beyond absolute stupidity, and the authorities could hardly claim to be ignorant of the fact that Ballarat was a tinderbox of social unrest at the time. I'm actually surprised it didn't cause another riot, to be honest. The arrest of 3 men for something hundreds had been involved in was the catalyst which drove the diggers to take further action against the licence, the land question and general corruption on the goldfields. It led to the formation of the Ballarat Reform League, led by Welsh Chartist and lawyer John Basson Humphrey, who was an experienced political agitator who believed in making change through peaceful, constitutional means and absolutely deplored violence. Lalor plays down Humphrey's massive contribution in the early weeks of the Reform League in his letter and suggests, in a sidelong fashion, that the reason Humphrey preferred non-violent means was because he lacked the will and ability to do anything else. Now, like Lalor, Humphrey was elected to the Victorian Parliament in November 1855, showing he lacked neither the will nor ability to make change, whatever his erstwhile ally might have thought. Lalor never came out and called Humphrey a coward, although quite a few others did, and this is another sign of Lalor's intelligence. The number of people in Ballarat, both before and after the stockade, who had completely supported the stockaders and agreed with their methods, was actually very few. Most of Ballarat agreed with their aims, but had not agreed with their violent stand, and quite a few had suffered directly because of it. Lalor was aware of this. He was also aware that Humphrey had similar political ambitions to his own. Remember, at the time of writing his letter, Lalor wants to be elected to Parliament within the next few months, and he knows Humphrey does too. Humphrey also isn't in hiding and is someone many of the people in Ballarat know, like and trust. He wasn't involved in the stockade, so he hadn't been arrested, and he'd continued to agitate for the rights of the Ballarat community, including the arrested stockaders. Those people who lost homes and property in the stockade, or who were robbed by the stockaders, something we'll touch on shortly, were likely to vote for Humphrey in an upcoming election, and Lalor knew it. Presenting Humphrey as a bit player who wasn't prepared to take a stand is a subtle way of putting down a future political rival. Lalor then jumps almost immediately from the 17th of October to the 29th of November, when a large meeting was held at which he spoke for the first time. Now, if we believe Lalor, nothing worth mentioning took place between those dates, yet several very important events had occurred. He knew about all of them, and he only makes passing mention of one, as if to suggest that it might have been important, but probably not. These events. A commission of inquiry had been set up to examine the grievances on the goldfields, and several people, including Lalor, had testified. The magistrates heading this inquiry had already signalled that they felt the licence fee was inoperable and the way it was enforced bred discontent, and that they were going to recommend it be abolished. Victoria's first constitution, with a form of manhood suffrage, was on its way to Britain to be ratified by the British Parliament. James Bentley had been found guilty of murder, although admittedly he'd received a rather short sentence. And Sir Charles Hotham had received a deputation from the diggers, which had included Humphrey, and had made assurances in writing that he would implement the recommendations of the Goldfields Commission of Inquiry. The chief frustration of the diggers now was that they had to wait for the inquiry to report, and many of them, not unreasonably as it turned out, did not trust Hotham's promises. However, this was huge progress for them, and it had all been achieved through non-violence. In other words, it had all been achieved without Lalor. He mentions the deputation to Hotham in passing, possibly because it was reported in the papers at the time, but his deliberate leaving out of the other important events, which he knew about but which his readers may not, especially if they were in the cities, shows him to be less interested in the truth and more in building a following. If he was going to be elected to Parliament, he needed people to believe that everything that happened before the 29th of November was merely a series of sideshows to the main event. Now, this meeting on the 29th was really significant for a number of reasons, not just because it was the first meeting where Lalor publicly spoke. The diggers were, understandably, impatient at the pace of change and were made even angrier by the short sentence Bentley had received and the fact that the 3 men arrested at random for burning the hotel had also been convicted of arson and sent to prison. It was probably unfortunate that these 2 pieces of information reached Ballarat at the same time, although that was due to poor chance. So the meeting, which was held on the 29th of November, was especially wild. Diggers were also fuming that the Ballarat authorities were still conducting licence hunts and arresting licensed and unlicensed diggers alike, and this was the meeting where things began to descend into serious violence. Although there were several moments along the way where Eureka could have been avoided by both sides. But back to Lalor's letter. He makes a lot of the fact that this meeting was the first time he'd ever spoken in public, and he'll warm to this theme of being a reluctant leader as the letter continues, as we will also see later. He doesn't mention that he only got up to speak after John Basson Humphrey and the other moral force men had been howled down by the crowd. Their crime? Reminding the diggers that they were going to get everything they wanted through peaceful means. The Goldfields Commission was on their side. They had written assurances from the governor that he was going to implement the recommendations he received, although I must say I can't blame the diggers for not trusting Hotham at this point. And the delay in the Constitution, remember the Victorian Constitution was in Britain at this very moment, was due to an unrelated squabble over another bill which was taking place in the London Parliament. Britain saw the matter of the colonial constitution as a secondary concern to, well, everything, to be honest, which was stupid, but given the distance and the time taken to travel, it was foolish of anyone to think that the constitution would be ratified quickly. So I can understand why the diggers were tired of being told, wait. But Lalor's decision to take advantage of this frustration and use it to curry violence is obscene. Humphrey was so disgusted with the response he received to having done as the diggers asked of him that he resigned on the spot from the Ballarat Reform League. He did not want to be involved in violence or even talk of violence. And it was at this moment that Lalor took over. He admits that the meeting on the 29th was one where fiery speeches were made, but denies that the diggers were really considering violence. However, this flies in the face of an event that had taken place just the night before, which Lalor doesn't mention in his letter, where a party of unarmed soldiers sent up from Melbourne to reinforce government camp due to the increasingly violent rhetoric on the goldfields were attacked by the diggers. The soldiers had been brought up to the goldfields in carts, and a lot of them were still very unwell, given they'd only arrived from England a few days earlier, and they'd got lost trying to find their way to government camp because they'd arrived after sunset in Ballarat. They ended up on the Eureka lead, and one of their officers had asked directions from a local storekeeper, and these were being provided when a large mob of diggers, quite a few of them armed, attacked the soldiers in their carts. They set on these men with rocks, bottles, fists and firearms. They overturned their carts, they set them on fire, and they even chased a few of the soldiers down mine shafts. Those few soldiers who were armed or who were able to get their muskets from the baggage train before the diggers looted it tried to defend themselves, and ragged shooting from both sides brought more diggers to the scene. Those soldiers already in government camp had to mount a rescue operation to collect their colleagues, some of who had been seriously injured and would be in hospital for more than a week after this attack, to prevent the diggers from killing them. I suspect that Lalor omits this point to give himself and his men more credibility. Public sympathy may not have stretched to supporting attempted murder, and leaving out the attack on the 28th also allows Lalor to suggest to his reader that violence only ever came from the authorities. Now, the authorities were not saints in the lead up to the Eureka Stockade, and they certainly were not blameless either. But the attack on the 28th puts the meeting on the 29th in a very different light. Many of the speakers, Lalor included, suggested that it was time to take the fight to the authorities and storm government camp. Some went even further than this and declared that they should not only drive off the authorities, but that once they had done so, they should declare Ballarat a free republic. One of those swept up in the pipe dream of independence was Lalor himself, and really he should have known better. He'd seen what had happened to his brother, among many others, when the Young Ireland movement had broken up. And as someone else who was at the meeting reflected later, Lalor was of the belief that if Ballarat achieved independence, the whole colony of Victoria would follow suit. Lalor does not deny making these speeches, but he says it was all talk. It was all men blowing off steam. And certainly it was true that there weren't enough people in Ballarat, let alone Victoria, who would have supported any serious attempt at revolution. But it didn't look like men blowing off steam to the authorities. The diggers were waxing violent. They were threatening the safety of government camp. They were threatening the police, military and judiciary who lived there, along with the civilian staff and the families of the men. Something Lalor also fails to mention is that the diggers now had a significant amount of guns stolen from the soldiers' baggage train on the 28th of November, in addition to the arms they already had, and they were openly and loudly planning a revolution. However improbable actual victory may have been in hindsight. Something else that Lalor leaves out, but that the diggers involved in the meeting on the 29th were perfectly aware of, was that they massively outnumbered the police and military at government camp. At that meeting alone, there were 25 armed diggers for every one soldier, and that's only if we include those soldiers still in hospital after the attack the previous night. Given the situation, the authorities had to take threats against government camp seriously. They were not in a position to hold it against men who outnumbered them 25-1. It's the same kind of thing as airport staff who have to take it seriously when some moron decides they'd like to joke about having explosives in their pants. For the authorities at Eureka, given the diggers had already launched one attack, they had reason to believe there would be another, especially when they could see these meetings and when there are magistrates present who are reporting back on everything that is being said. And this is how we know that Lalor is being fast and loose with the truth in his letter to the newspaper in 1855. The magistrates' shorthand notes still exist in the Public Records Office of Victoria, along with the full transcripts that were produced for the civilian and military authorities. We know Lalor and many other speakers that day were openly discussing a revolution, and revolutions are, by their nature, offensive. They are not defensive actions. But by the time Lalor was writing his letter, he had pulled his head out of the clouds and was aware that there was no public appetite for separation from Britain, except in very small pockets of colonial society, and least of all by violent means. So, like the attack on the soldiers on the 28th, he deliberately omits this aspect of the meeting on the 29th and focuses instead on an action which did enjoy public support, both at the time and later. And this was the burning of gold licenses by a small number of diggers. Dramatic reimaginings of this event show hundreds of diggers gleefully lining up to toss their licences away into a raging bonfire, but it was probably much quieter. Lalor burned his licence, as did his friend Timothy Hayes, the chairman of the meeting, along with prominent future stockaders such as Frederick Verne and Raffaello Carboni. From the accounts we have of this action, which do include Lalor's letter, we know that more than 4 licences were burned, but hundreds? Absolutely not. Lalor claims only a small number of licences were burned in his letter, and in this instance, he's absolutely being truthful. After all, very few men, no matter how fired up they may have been, would have been prepared to burn 30 shillings when they had no guaranteed income. And in any case, only about 50% of diggers in Ballarat habitually took out a licence. Plenty of men probably wanted to participate, but simply didn't have a licence to burn. There were also at least 2 cases, although there may have been more, of men burning their licences at the meeting and then later going up to government camp to have another one issued, but they were very much in the minority. Most men would not have been in a position to burn their licences and then buy another one. However, the licence burning was of less concern to the authorities than the resolutions passed afterwards. Lalor led the diggers in declaring that they would henceforth not only refuse to produce their licences when asked, but that if any man was arrested for not having a licence, they would storm government camp and come to his aid. Lalor freely admits to passing the first resolution in his letter, but completely omits the second, which is the more troubling one. The diggers are, quite understandably at this point, angry. They are hot under the collar, and by the 29th of November, they are seriously beginning to overestimate themselves. They started by talking about attacking government camp, and now they've promised that they'll do so. Are you seeing a pattern to this letter, dear listener? A pattern of omitting events which do not suit Mr. Lalor's narrative? Because I most certainly am. I want you to consider the authorities' position on the 29th of November as well, and consider how it contributed to their actions at the Eureka Stockade. Imagine watching a gathering of armed men who outnumber you 25 to 1, promise to attack your home if they break the law. The situation needed a steady hand and cool heads, 2 things notably absent from either side, as we'll hear in a moment, and it was dangerously irresponsible of Lalor to deliberately rile up armed and angry men. However, his reasons for not mentioning this aspect of his behaviour on the 29th go deeper than wanting to avoid scrutiny for his actions. He is actively setting up the reader of his letter to be outraged by what the authorities did the next day on the 30th of November. And what was that exactly? Well, I'll tell you just as soon as I get back from this break. And welcome back to The Skeptical Historian Writes a Thesis with Juliana Byers. So, following on from this meeting on the 29th and from everything the authorities knew had been said and done, the sensible course of action would have been to suspend licence hunts at the very least until the Gold Commission released their report and allow things on the goldfields to cool down. Unfortunately, the highest civilian authority in Ballarat was Gold Commissioner Robert Reid, who was about as cool, calm and collected as an erupting volcano. He was also a man with a high opinion of himself and aristocratic pretensions. He believed the diggers were nothing more than low-class riffraff and was determined to put them in their place. So, instead of stepping back, he made a decision so monumentally stupid that it made his random arrest of 3 men after burning the hotel look perfectly reasonable. He decided to mount a massive and violent licence hunt on the 30th of November, the day after he'd watched a number of diggers burn their licences and swear to attack the camp with force if any among them were arrested for not having one. In his mind, such a show of strength would demonstrate to the diggers that he was in charge and they needed to fall in line. He ordered the chief of police in Ballarat to send the majority of his men out to the gravel pits, the area of the diggings closest to government camp, and arrest any man without a licence. And Reid decided to go with them. Lalor describes the event in his letter thus. On Thursday morning, the police and military came out to look for licences. A digger, who, I presume, had no licence, was running away when an officer ordered his men to fire on him, to shoot him down, and he was fired at. I positively assert that the Riot Act had not been read when the digger was fired at. In fact, the diggers believed that some of those in authority had come out that morning with the determination of having the diggers fired on. Very traumatic stuff and completely illegal on the part of the authorities. But given Lawler's proven propensity to leave out important context and details, we must ask ourselves whether or not it is true. As it turns out, some of it is. But Lalor has, not surprisingly, left out a very important point in the telling of this particular story. He wasn't there. The riot at the gravel pits was a real event, and it really was caused by Reid's stupidity and hubris, but it didn't happen as Lalor, who was 150 feet underground on another part of the goldfields when it started, would have it. He arrived later, towards the end of the riot, and only saw the closing of what had been a shockingly violent clash between police, the military, and the diggers. He saw a man running. He saw police firing at the man. Thankfully, he wasn't hit and was able to escape. And saw the authorities withdrawing with 7 unlicensed diggers as prisoners. However, there was a whole series of events which led up to that point, which included, despite Lalor's claims to the contrary, the reading of the Riot Act. Let me break it down for you. Reid's fear of rebellion on the diggings led him to conducting a very violent licence hunt, at a time when he knew a number of diggers did not have licences. The diggers, who were angry about the continued misgovernment, among other things, and who were also beginning to see themselves as a single entity, initially refused Reid's orders to produce their licences for him and his men when they arrived on the gravel pits. Rocks, bottles, rubbish, and lumps of quartz were thrown at Reid and the police, and Reid decided to read the Riot Act. Now today, when we tell someone, I'll read you the Riot Act, it's usually a young child who's finally got under our skin, but in 1854 the Riot Act was a deadly serious thing. It was a kind of legal exceptionalism, as Carolyn Elkins defines in her book Legacy of Violence, which was used to break up large meetings that British authorities deemed riotous. Now, there were almost no limits on when the Riot Act could be read, and it was usually up to the discretion of the highest civil authority figure in a district, but once it was read, it bestowed enormous power. It allowed police or the military to open fire on any demonstrators who did not disperse when ordered without facing any consequences for doing so. From a modern perspective, it's a terrible piece of legislation, and it wasn't designed with law and order in mind, but rather was an instrument of control and coercion. But no matter how unpalatable it was legal in its day. And, more to the point for our story, it was read at the gravel pits in 1854. However, if Reid thought that reading the Riot Act was going to calm things down, he was mistaken. Now, some diggers did disperse, but most were prepared to call his bluff and dare him to shoot. Now, interestingly here, he didn't order his men to shoot. Instead, he sent for the military. The soldiers arrived and were subjected to similar abuse by the diggers, but their officer, a man named Captain Charles Paisley, wasn't prepared to order his men to fire if Reid wasn't going to give similar orders to the police. In the meantime, the crowd got larger and angrier, and Paisley decided that the area did need to be cleared, although he wasn't going to fire on the diggers. He gave an order for bayonets to be fixed, and had his men march forward in a line abreast formation. This meant that the soldiers marched in an extended line at the same pace, with their bayonets lowered. Anyone who didn't get out of the way of such a formation would be either impaled or trampled, or, if you were very unlucky, both. But thankfully, the diggers weren't stupid and didn't hang around to see if the soldiers really would go so far as to stick them with bayonets. The shooting that Lalor describes in his letter started shortly after this. In the wake of the soldiers, the police began arresting diggers at random and demanding their licenses. Now, the diggers, and probably quite a large number of civilians too, were fleeing every which way at this point, and police decided that any man running was fair game, and individual officers began firing. Again, because the Riot Act had been read, it was technically legal, but it was a weak technicality, and it inflamed the already irate diggers. Those who were armed, which was the majority, as guns were as necessary as a pick or a gold pan in Ballarat at this time, stopped running and returned fire, and other diggers who were attracted by the sounds of the riot arrived to either join the resistance or help their friends and families get away from the shooting. It was at this point that Peter Lalor arrived and saw one of the many fleeing diggers shot at. He hadn't heard the Riot Act being read, and assumed that what he was seeing was the entirety of the situation. It was an ugly situation, certainly, and it was purely because there weren't enough men on either side that it didn't turn into a pitched battle. But eventually, the authorities withdrew, taking 7 prisoners with them, and a large mass of very angry diggers assembled at Bakery Hill for an impromptu meeting. Feelings were running high, and perhaps feeling mildly invincible. No one had been killed at the gravel pits, although this was pure luck and had nothing to do with good management by anybody on either side. The diggers' plans for an armed stand began to grow bolder, and they reaffirmed their commitment to storming government camp and rescuing their fellows who had been arrested that morning. In fact, this meeting got so heated that soldiers were deployed at the entrances to the camp with orders to repel any attempt to enter it. But as it happens, the diggers did something else entirely, which we will look at in just a moment. So, was Lalor lying when he declared that the police and the military appeared on the gravel pits and started shooting? Well, no, but he didn't bother to check his facts or corroborate his story with anyone who had actually been there for the entirety of the riot. He was absolutely right to condemn the behaviour of the police in particular, and I still, 170 years later, cannot get past Reed's idiocy in staging a huge licence hunt that day. But Lalor's attempt to paint the authorities as a bloodthirsty mob who wanted to shoot the diggers is stretching the truth. Reed made a stupid challenge. The diggers responded with one of their own, and then the authorities responded, and the diggers responded, and before long, people were shooting. It reminds me very much of that saying, play stupid games, win stupid prizes, which is what everybody got that day. However, blame for this event can fairly be put on Reed's shoulders, as he should have exercised better judgment and decided not to rile up angry men with an unnecessary provocation. But what about this meeting on Bakery Hill that occurred in the aftermath? Well, I think now's a good time for another break. And when we come back, we're going to examine Lalor's account of this gathering and especially take a closer look at what is not being said. Stick around, I'll be back. And the skeptical historian writes a thesis is back. Now, Lalor's account of the Bakery Hill meeting on the 30th of November reads very much like a timeline of events. A happened, then B happened, then C happened, then D happened, and so on and so forth. This meeting is actually a very important one in the history of Eureka because this is where the famous oath was sworn under the Southern Cross flag. It's when the diggers formed into military-esque companies. It's when they produced arms and made the decision to build a fortified defensive position, the famous stockade. In short, this is the moment where the diggers went from being angry, partially organised civilians into an angry, partially organised insurgent force. They became combatants and so placed themselves outside the protections offered to civilians. Lalor maintained that their intentions were purely defensive, while at the same time saying they were making plans to storm government camp and rescue the men who'd been arrested that afternoon. Like the great nations of Europe during the First World War, Lalor wanted to have it both ways, but it goes without saying that you cannot claim to be fighting a defensive battle if you are simultaneously planning an offensive attack. It is also during his account of this meeting that the politician in Lalor once again reveals themselves. He spoke at length at the November 30th meeting. He led the oath-taking beneath the Southern Cross. He called for companies to be formed, and he ordered men to procure arms, which they did gladly. Yet he says he only did so because, through some accident or other, none of the regular speakers were present. He colourfully paints a picture of himself striding to the front of the crowd, throwing his fist in the air and proclaiming "Liberty!" to all assembled and being greeted with raucous cheers. But that he only did it because no one else would do so. This is a theme that continues throughout the rest of this letter. Everything that follows is either someone else's fault or it was inevitable. Lalor actually reminds me quite strongly here of Ned Kelly, the bushranger who went to the gallows blaming everyone except himself for the choices he made. Lalor too had choices, but he devotes much of his letter to blaming other people for his actions. No one made him get up in front of a crowd of angry men and suggest that forming an insurgent army was a good idea. He did it all by himself, and given his background, I'm actually surprised he did. As I've mentioned before, he'd seen his brother die of heartbreak after a similar movement in Ireland had been violently crushed. Lalor's thoughts at the time will never be known, and his letter written after the fact doesn't give any hint of them, perhaps because he knew that admitting he got swept up in a foolhardy dream that cost the lives of 30 people, although we now know it was more like 60, would have been bad for his political career. His point about the regular speakers not appearing refers to Humphrey and the moral force men who believed in peaceful constitutional agitation. As mentioned, Humphrey had already resigned from the Ballarat Reform League, and he had nothing ever to do with the physical force side of the movement, and Lalor would have known full well that the other man was not going to speak at such an obviously violent meeting. Lalor's reference to Humphrey here is nothing more than an attempt to deflect blame from himself for his actions and his choices. If only someone else had got up, he is saying, then he would have kept his peace and none of this would have happened. This is a moot point and counterfactual in the extreme because Lalor did get up. He chose to get up and so bears some responsibility for all the violence which followed. Over the next 2 days, there were several large armed gatherings at Bakery Hill, and Lalor's insurgents started remedying their deficiencies, especially in terms of their amount of arms and ammunition compared to the government. Now, it's important to note that Ballarat in 1854 was a community. It wasn't just men down the gold mines and the police and military up in their fenced-off enclave. People lived there, they worked there, they were raising their children there. There were doctors, lawyers, teachers, auctioneers, storekeepers, butchers, bakers, newspaper editors, housewives, domestic servants, stable hands, bullock drivers, clerks, publicans, sex workers, accountants, dressmakers, and I could go on. Some of these people were on the diggers' side. Others were supporting the government. But from what we can tell regarding support for either side of the movement, the vast majority of the community in Ballarat simply wanted to get on with their lives, and they were frightened of the increasing violence, especially when it was unleashed on them. And over the next 2 days, Lalor's men certainly unleashed some violence on the civilian population of Ballarat. He says that they spent this time procuring arms, electing officers, and improving organisation. Again, he would like his reader to know that everything is defensive, but all these actions are belligerent. Lalor also doesn't mention that all this procuring, especially when it came to arms and ammunition, involved assault and robbery. While some storekeepers were prepared to donate arms and ammunition to the diggers, or accept receipts, and these were useless, the stockaders had no money, others refused, not unreasonably, to part with their goods without payment. But storekeepers who refused to supply guns or other goods to the stockaders were viciously beaten, and many of them not only had firearms and other essentials taken, but quite a few were robbed of their strong boxes. In one case, one storekeeper was robbed of a strong box containing 20 pounds and had some personal items taken as well, including a gold watch. Lalor claimed that he told the stockaders to only take what they needed and that he would be the first to shoot any man he caught looting. But it's the first part of this sentence that is important. Lalor gave permission for his men to go and rob people on the diggings. His promise to shoot anyone he saw looting was absurd because he didn't go down to the diggings with the raiding parties, but holed up in a friend's tent with his council of war. Of course, like everyone involved in this saga, the men had a choice. They could have told Lalor to go to hell and rob the stores himself, but they didn't. However, this doesn't excuse Lalor, who by this point had been elected commander-in-chief of the stockaders. Now, his claims that he and his men were still waging a defensive battle have as much truth at this stage as Austria-Hungary's claim in 1914 that they were fighting a defensive war against Serbia. But by the time Lalor was writing this letter in 1855, he knew that admitting to condoning assault and robbery would erode some of the public sympathy for him and would undoubtedly be damaging for his future political prospects, so he omitted it. Many of the storekeepers attacked by his men were never compensated for their goods, and some undoubtedly suffered lifelong complications, both physical and psychological, from the attacks they suffered and from the trauma of being robbed at gunpoint. Lalor is actively and deliberately obscuring his actions here and making a concerted attempt to have a blatantly criminal episode written out of history. Thankfully, he failed, mostly thanks to the many storekeepers who required medical attention after being beaten and robbed by his men. But his attempt to control the narrative gives a sense of what he's trying to do in his letter. It's no longer an account of anything. This is a manifesto. This becomes even more obvious in the next part of the letter. He discusses his election as commander-in-chief and purports to be humble, saying he knew nothing of military matters and didn't know how to run an army, but didn't think he could let his men down when they had bestowed such an honour upon him. He was probably not exaggerating about his lack of experience, as he'd never served in the army, and unlike his older brother, he hadn't been involved in the Young Ireland movement or any other insurgent movements either. But we need to consider this claim in light of everything else he has said in his letter. Up until this point, he has taken every opportunity to whip up angry men. He'd sent them out into the community to beat and rob anyone who didn't support them. And he was also considering where best to build what would become the fortified musket-proof stockade. But he didn't want to be commander-in-chief. Do these actions really sound like those of someone who wanted to take a back seat? I don't think so. What Lalor really thought or said at his election to commander-in-chief will never be known, but I think it's highly likely that he presented himself as having more experience than he did in anti-government agitation and quite possibly encouraged the men to elect him. After all, this is a man who's being swept up in dreams of independence, for crying out loud. He's not going to leave that to anyone else. What he is doing in this part of the letter, I believe, is trying to distance himself from the outcome. Remember, it's April 1855 by this point, and everyone already knows how Eureka ended. By highlighting his inexperience and purporting that he had been humble about his elevation, Lalor is once again involved in blame shifting. What happened can't be his fault. It was inevitable because of his inexperience. But he wants the reader to know that he couldn't possibly let his men down by refusing to take the appointment. He claims he tried to resign and hand the position over to a man named Frederick Verne, who appears to have had some military experience, but that he didn't because when he told his friends of this decision, they informed him that the movement would break up if he was not leading it. Now, given the large number of men now involved, many of them who were militarily and politically experienced, this is highly unlikely. Remember, until just a few days before, Peter Lalor had been a relative unknown in Ballarat. Why would the stockaders have thrown down their arms and gone home had he not retained his position? Now, whether this was actually said or whether Lalor invented it, I don't know, but it has a ring of inauthenticity. Like his determination to focus on the meeting on the 29th, where he spoke for the first time, or his decision not to check his facts about the Gravel Pits Riot, our political friend is yet again being fast and loose with the truth. He was certainly a very good orator, so this may have led people to believe he had more experience than he did, but as mentioned, it's also very possible that he presented himself this way as well. As we've also seen throughout this letter, he goes to great lengths to make himself appear very important at every stage of this movement, even though he actually came to it quite late. And a final important point about Frederick Verne, who was a significant player in the stockade, although has been very much vilified by history. After Lalor was elected Commander-in-Chief, he offered Verne the position of Second-in-Command. Lalor claims that Verne turned it down and went off into a sulk. In fact, Verne accepted the position of Second-in-Command and held it until Lalor sacked him in favour of an American who claimed to be a West Point graduate 2 days later. And on that note, skeptics, I'm going to end part 1 of our consideration into Peter Lalor's political manifesto. As always, if you want to get in touch with me, you can reach out on social media. I am Juliana Byers on both LinkedIn and Instagram. And I'm so excited to let you know that my website is back up and running. And you can now find me online once again at www.skepticalhistory.com. That is skeptical with a K. We'll pick up in 2 weeks' time with what Mr. Lalor has to say about the building of the Eureka Stockade, the battle itself, and the bloody aftermath. So take care, keep safe, and I'll talk to you again soon. And make sure you stick around after the credits if you want to hear the first half of Peter Lalor's letter. Bye now. The Skeptical Historian is research produced and hosted by me, Juliana Byers. You can find a full list of resources used in my research by going to my rss.com podcast page, clicking on the relevant episode and opening the transcript before scrolling down to the sources section. That's www.rss.com/the-skeptical-historian. Our sound effects are by Adobe Creative Cloud, Pixabay and Epidemic Sound, used under the appropriate licenses. The music track The Whistle Funk by Telsonic was also used under this license. Podcast hosting is by rss.com. See you next time, skeptics. Peter Lalor's Letter to the Colonists, Part 1. To the Colonists of Victoria. Fellow colonists, my name, having appeared so conspicuously at the late state trials as the person who principally incited the diggers to take up arms, I consider myself bound to justify to you and to the world the course I then pursued, and, as the insurgents placed so much confidence in me to elect me their leader, honour compels me to justify their conduct and to snatch from oblivion the names of my brave companions who fell on the eventful morning of the 3rd of December. In thus addressing you, I am well aware that I shall incur still more the wrath of the government, but that consideration cannot keep me back from stating the truth. You will now allow me to draw your attention to a period previous to the burning of Bentley's Hotel. For a considerable time before that event, the people were dissatisfied with the laws because they excluded them from the possession of land, from being represented in the Legislative Council, and imposed on them an odious poll tax. The diggers were subjected to the most unheard of insults and cruelties in the collection of this tax, being in many instances chained to logs if they could not produce their licence. I have often known men to be asked for their licence 4 or 5 times in the course of a day, and this having been more particularly the case since the arrival of Sir Charles Hotham. The water to be contended with in deep sinking compels the diggers to frequently change their dress. In doing so, they very often leave their licences behind. Under such circumstances, should they be visited by the police, they are dragged, wet and dripping as they may be, to the prison like common felons. The scarcity of gold made the diggers feel these evils more keenly. The corruption of the government officials in endeavouring to screen Bentley and the burning of the Eureka Hotel gave an impulse to the public mind which, it was plain to see, could not subside without reform. So little confidence had the diggers in the administration of justice that they actually formed a committee to prosecute the murderer of Scobie. There were 3 prisoners arrested for the burning of the hotel. The diggers felt that those 3 men should not be victimised for an act in which we were all concerned, and which was provoked by the corruption of the officials. A committee was organised to have the prisoners defended. This committee also formed the nucleus of the Reform League and issued cards at membership for the League. A deputation was sent to the Lieutenant Governor to demand the release of the prisoners, the unlocking of the lands, perfect representation, and the abolition of the digger's licence. His Excellency stated that, owing to various causes, he could not grant these requests. The committee resolved, only by a majority of 1, to propose a public meeting to be held on Wednesday, the 29th of November, that the diggers should burn their licences. A few licences only were burnt that day, but the meeting unanimously resolved to take out no more licences. On Thursday morning, the police and military came out to look for licences. A digger, who I presume had no licence, was running away, when an officer of police ordered his men to fire on him, to shoot him down, and he was fired at. I positively assert that the Riot Act had not been read when the digger was fired at. See Mr. S. Cummings' evidence before the Gold Commission. In fact, the diggers believed that some of those in authority had come out that morning with the determination of having the diggers fired on. Now, fellow colonists, I have candidly confessed to you all our rashness and all our errors, and I confidently appeal to your judgment and ask, do you justify the government in acting as they did on Thursday? Can you say that the government did not trample on the Constitution by its officers ordering the troopers or military, before the Riot Act was read, to fire on some unlicensed diggers who were running away? I am satisfied that you cannot. You and the world must pronounce against the government. When these occurrences took place, I was working in a shaft at the Eureka, 140 feet deep. Mr. Hayes, that is Peter Lawler's friend Timothy Hayes, was at the windlass, and the diggers were employed as usual. I mention these details to show you there was nothing preconcerted. Suddenly, the news was spread that the diggers were being fired on at the gravel pits. "To arms!" was the cry, and all that could muster arms moved forward in great confusion towards the gravel pits. When we reached Barker and Hunt's store on Specimen Hill, we perceived that the military had taken up a position behind some logs on Bakery Hill. We did not interfere with them. The Southern Cross was produced and hoisted on the flagstaff belonging to Barker and Hunt, but it was almost immediately hauled down, and we moved down to the holes on the gravel pits flat. These holes lie near the road, between the camp and the position which the soldiers occupied. As soon as we commenced moving towards the holes, the bugles of the military sounded a retreat, and the detachment withdrew to the camp. It was then proclaimed by many persons that there would be a meeting in arms that evening at Bakery Hill. I went there about 4 o'clock p.m. There were considerable numbers then assembled. We waited for some time, expecting some of our public speakers to come forward and address us, but through some accident or other, not one of them was present. Previous to that meeting, I have never attempted to speak in public but once, and that was on the day previous. I looked around me. I saw brave and honest men who had come thousands of miles to labour for independence. I knew that hundreds were in great poverty, who would possess wealth and happiness if allowed to cultivate the wilderness which surrounded us. The grievances under which we had long suffered and the brutal attack of that day flashed across my mind, and with the burning feelings of an injured man, I mounted the stump and proclaimed, "Liberty!" I called for volunteers to come forward and arrange themselves in companies. Hundreds responded to the call. I declared that no violence should be done to the peaceably disposed. In fact, I solemnly promised to shoot the first man who took any property from another except arms and ammunition and what was necessary for the volunteers to use in their defence. This declaration was loudly responded to. While addressing the volunteers from the stump, several hundreds came forward and asked me for arms, evidently strongly impressed with the idea that, in the state of feeling then evinced towards them by the authorities at the camp, it was necessary to be united and armed for self-defence. The only plan of operations I attempted to lay down was that if the government forces came to attack us, we should meet them on the gravel pits and, if compelled, we should retreat by the heights to the old Canadian gully and there make our final stand. I then called on the volunteers to kneel down. They did so, with heads uncovered and hands raised to heaven. They solemnly swore at all the hazards to defend their rights and liberties. They promised to meet next morning and then separated. Great excitement now prevailed throughout the diggings, and early next Friday morning, some armed diggers began to assemble on Bakery Hill, but on the military and police moving upon them in force, they dispersed. About 7 o'clock in the morning, about 200 armed diggers from Eureka, of which I was one, marched to Bakery Hill and hoisted the Southern Cross. So great was the horror excited in the minds of the diggers by the unconstitutional and bloodthirsty attack of the previous day that in about 2 hours we numbered about 1,500 armed men. After a few hours' organisation, it was proposed by some that we should march to Eureka, which was accordingly done a little after midday. The rest of the day was spent in procuring arms, electing officers and improving the organisation. A meeting of the captains of the various companies was held to elect a leader. I was chosen. One of those who had taken rather a conspicuous part in the movement, having exhibited some disappointment at my election, the votes of the men were taken and the result was that my election was confirmed. However, so anxious was I to prevent disunion that I went to several influential men in the movement and informed them that it was my intention to resign in order to present the dissatisfaction of even a few. From what they told me, I was induced to retain my command because I was led to believe that, if I resigned, a large majority of those under arms would leave the movement altogether. Being personally unacquainted with military details, I felt anxious to procure the cooperation of one experienced in them. Mr. Verne, being elected the second in command, and having often heard him allude to passages in his military life, I requested his assistance, which he declined. This occurred on Friday evening, shortly after which the men retired to their homes.